Hey guys, welcome to the Mecha painting series here on Otaku on a Budget. This is episode 1, and in this episode we're just going to be talking about airbrushing basics. We won't be doing any airbrushing yet in this episode, so if you're already used to it, you can just go ahead and skip this one. But if you're new to airbrushing or you're still thinking about getting into airbrushing your model kits, then this is the episode for you, so stick around. Alright, now I'm sure you've already seen an airbrush or at least have an idea of what it looks like, but I'm going to show you one anyway. This right here is an airbrush. This is the Harder & Steenbeck Evolution Silverline. It's a very good airbrush, and I'm choosing to show this airbrush to you because it resembles a lot of the other airbrushes out there. It's a very recognizable look. It's an all chrome body, shaped like a pen with a cup sticking out on top. And later on we're going to be breaking this down into its individual parts so we can understand how it works. But before we get into that, we need to answer the most basic, the most pertinent of questions, which is why. Why is Gamora? Lost my script. So why get into airbrushing? Now, first and foremost, airbrushing, it's a whole lot of fun. I mean, if you enjoy snapping your kits together and, just using the stickers that come with the kit, learning to paint your kits, especially with an airbrush, opens up a whole new experience in the hobby. You can double the amount of time you spend on a kit and get a much better result once you finish it. So it's very, very rewarding to learn how to paint your model kits. Secondly, it's also economical when it comes to paint. With an airbrush, you apply very thin, almost translucent layers of paint on the surface of the kit, whereas compared to, say, a paintbrush that you just dip in the paint pot and just slather onto the kit, you're applying a thicker layer compared to what you can achieve with an airbrush. And of course, since you're applying very, very thin layers in each pass, you can achieve a lot of different effects as well. So it's really, really fun to learn all the different techniques that you can get from an airbrush. So let's lay this down on the mat and let's break it down so we can see how it works. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the airbrush. Now, an airbrush is a pneumatic tool, so it's powered by compressed air, which means you're going to need a compressor of some type to feed air into the base right here. And airbrushes are classified by the location of their paint cup. Now, this right here is a gravity feed, which means gravity is responsible for pulling paint down into the body of the airbrush and out the front. Now there's also the side feed airbrush, which has the paint cup a little to the left or to the right, and that usually has the advantage of being able to twist the cup forwards or backwards. And you might want to use that if you were painting a little upwards at an angle, because you don't want the paint spilling back out over your arm, so you want to be able to twist the cup forwards. And it also has the advantage of a clearer line of sight down the length of the airbrush. So that's usually preferable for illustrators and people who do portraits and stuff like that. Now there's also the siphon feed or the bottle feed airbrush, which will have the cup somewhere along the bottom over here. And that usually has the advantage of being able to switch out different bottles, because you can keep a lot of different bottles, different colors in separate bottles. So if you need to be able to switch colors quickly while working, then a bottle feed airbrush is something you want to look into, and that's usually preferable for people who paint t-shirts and things like that. But for mecha painting, for Gunpla, usually the gravity feed airbrush is the design of choice, simply because it's a little bit easier to clean than the other two. It has fewer parts, and we don't really need the line of sight down the length of the brush, because we usually mount the parts that we paint on a painting stick. So if this was your painting stick, you need to maneuver it with your left hand and paint a little off to the side like this. So you can't have a bottle feed that you have to support with your left hand, right, like this. So you want to have that other hand free to maneuver the part. And also airbrushes are classified by trigger action. So a single action airbrush will give you control over paint flow only, while a double action airbrush like this one will give you control over both air and paint. But usually air control is just an on-off thing, so you just turn on the air and then let the paint flow. And again, both designs have their own advantages and disadvantages. For instance, a single action airbrush will have the advantage of less chance of tip dry, simply because air is constantly flowing over the needle tip. So you won't have any paint pooling over at the front right here. So that's one advantage. But on the downside, since air is continuously flowing, that might affect how the paint levels and dries on the surface of your model. Now with a double action airbrush, since when you release the trigger the air cuts off, then that gives the compressor time to rest while you're working. So because if the air was constantly flowing, then that means that your compressor is working continuously. So now let's take the airbrush apart so we can understand how the parts work together. First thing that comes off is this part right here, which is referred to as the handle. And I'm not even sure why they call this the handle, because nobody really holds the airbrush this way. But yeah, this bit is called the handle, and it'll sometimes have this dial on the back which you can turn, and the function of that is to limit how far back the needle can move. And let me just show you how the trigger makes the needle move. So pulling back on the trigger pulls the needle back as well. So let's loosen up this needle nut, and that's what's clamping down onto the needle. We can pull that back very carefully. We don't want to bend the tip. And now I can undo the midsection, which houses the spring. Right there. And now you can take out your trigger. And you can disassemble the front end. You're going to have a needle cap, which is a protective cap for the needle. And this part is usually not really needed. It's just there to protect the needle really, but you can paint without it. Some artists actually prefer not to use that because it lets you get much closer to your work. And now we can unscrew the air cap. And in this airbrush, the air cap is what's holding the nozzle in place. So this is the nozzle. Get that to focus. There we go. And in some airbrushes, this nozzle screws into the body, but for Harder and Steenbeck airbrushes, this is a free-floating part, and what's called a self-centering nozzle. So let me just arrange these parts according to where they are on the airbrush, like so. And in some cases, even the cup can come off like that. Alright, so what happens when you manipulate the trigger? Now this is a double action airbrush, and by the way, you'll notice I have this white bit on top of my trigger here. That's just a bit of Sugru that I molded onto my trigger button to add a bit of comfort. But yeah, so when you move the trigger, when you push the trigger down like this, what that does is it opens the air valve that's located in this bit right here. So that opens up the air valve, and that lets air pass through the air channel that's machined into the airbrush body and out over the nozzle and out through the air cap. Now when you move the needle back, that's actually pushing against this bit right here, which is what's called a rocker. And in some airbrushes, this is a free-floating part or attached to the spring cylinder. So for Harder and Steenbeck airbrushes, it's attached to the trigger shaft itself. So when you're pulling this back, that's pushing against the spring cylinder, which in turn, since the needle is clamped down onto this needle nut, that's pulling the needle back as well. Now what's happening in the front end is, since the needle, so try to get that to focus. So it's a very fine conical shape. That cone, the cone of the needle, is actually machined to perfectly seat against the inside of this nozzle. So when the trigger is at rest, the needle is seated all the way forwards, so that's sealing the opening at the tip of the nozzle. So that's not letting any paint through. Once you pull the trigger back, the needle itself slides back. So it slides back, and this is inside this, by the way. So let me just stick that in very carefully so we don't bend it. So there you go. Not sure if you can see that. So when you pull the trigger back, the needle pulls back, and that makes a gap between the needle body and the nozzle opening, and that's where the paint flows through. So you can tell that your paint needs to be properly diluted in order to fit through that very, very, very tiny gap between the needle and the nozzle. So while you're pulling back on the needle, that's letting the paint flow through, and air is flowing over this nozzle. So that air is then going to pull onto that paint and pull it out and spray it out the front end. And that process is what's called atomization. Now, depending on the size of the needle and the nozzle combination, that's going to determine how fine you can get your lines. Now, obviously a 0.4 or 0.6 millimeter nozzle is going to produce a thicker line or a broader spray pattern than something with, say, a 0.15 millimeter tip. And of course that's going to depend on what type of work you're doing. If you're doing illustrations, of course you're going to need the finest tip available. But if you're painting, painting larger surfaces or doing base coats, then you're perfectly fine using something like a 0.3, 0.4, even a 0.5 millimeter tip. So yeah, that's basically how most double action airbrushes work. There are some exceptions, but we'll talk about that in a later episode. So yeah, just wanted to share with you just how simple actually the airbrush works. It's not really complicated. So that should take away some of the fear of disassembling it to do a proper cleaning. Alright, so I've reassembled the airbrush, and now let's talk about what else you're going to need to start airbrushing. Of course, you're going to need an air source, and I recommend getting a proper compressor like this one. So this is a compressor with an air tank from Hobbyworks. Let's just turn that off for now. So we've got the motor on top right here, and it's got a reserve tank on the bottom. I believe this is about 5 liters, and it's good for storing air so the compressor doesn't have to run full time. You're also going to want your compressor to have a gauge that shows how much air it's letting out. So that's a pressure gauge, a pressure regulator, and a water trap. So compressed air usually accumulates moisture, and also when the air starts heating up from the motor, then that's going to get a little moist. So you want to have a water trap on your compressor, so you can trap all that moisture and keep your air as dry as possible. Now, you're also going to want to have, especially if you're painting indoors, you're going to want to have a spray booth like this. So this is just something I built myself. It's got a fan, it's got lights, LED lights up top here, and I'll put a link down to the tutorial on how I built this spray booth. And that's really good for extracting all of the paint fumes and particulate out of your room. Keep your air, the air in your room clean. And of course, you're going to want to have a proper mask. Now, even with the spray booth, you can still expect that some of the particles are still flying around the room. So you're going to want to have a mask like this. This is the 3M 7502, I believe. I also have a review on this mask, and you can just go check it out. I'll put the link down below. So definitely good investment to have something like this. You want to be painting longer and keeping safe while you're painting. So this is going to make sure that you don't breathe in any noxious fumes. Right. So those are the things you need. Of course, later on in the next episodes, we'll talk about proper thinning and cleaning of the airbrush. So we'll get into that in later episodes. Alright, so I think we've covered enough for this episode. We've talked about the different types of airbrushes, the pros and cons between those types, and also the parts of the airbrush and how those parts work together. And I just wanted to get all this boring stuff out of the way. And I think it's important to note or to understand how the airbrush works in order for you to use it properly and, of course, safely. So in the next episode, we're going to be doing some basic exercises. We're going to learn the basic movements and things that you can practice even when your airbrush isn't hooked up to your compressor. So I'll see you again next time, and thanks for watching.